All right. Welcome to the oh my goodness. I was like, let me try to start it differently. And then I was like, actually, no, wait. Jamie will edit this out. It's fine. And I
Got it.
also say that
No.
almost I say that almost every episode too. Jamie who got this. Not that people ever hear that, but Jamie hears it a lot. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Maybe you should leave it. Maybe it's, a very human element of the podcast.
Absolutely. Yes. So welcome to Connect with Adult Ed. I'm Nadia Cater, your host, your admin, your PD person that you probably see at events. Jamie is out on assignment today, so I'm hitting this solo and hopefully I could handle it. I'm pretty sure I can. I came up with the questions. I'm joined today, a very special guest, Victoria Henry. Victoria, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's really exciting to me. Like Nadia said, my name is Victoria Henry. I am a doctoral candidate at Columbia University Teachers College. I'm doing my doctorate in curriculum and teaching. My work focuses on literacy education, literacy studies, broadly speaking, the intersections between literacy, culture, and power. But more specifically, my work deals with decolonial approaches to literacy education, in particular, the use of place-based learning, place-based pedagogies, and storytelling in the literacy classroom. And I'm a former employee of UNM Taos. I worked at the Taos Education and Career Center, where I oversaw adult literacy programming and taught language arts in the high school equivalency program. And I'm from Taos, so excited to be on a New Mexico oriented podcast.
Absolutely. Oh man, wonderful. Said that perfectly. So I was really fascinated by your work because I have not met a lot of people, first of all, PhD candidates are interested in adult education, let alone adult literacy, well, literacy in general. So that was really fascinating. And we have had some literacy people on the podcast before. We talked more to a program director. We've talked to adult education students. We've done a couple of different things. So this is again like another different thing. So this was really exciting to talk to someone in research. So what are some of the critical theories or theorists that you're using in your work?
Yeah, so both in my research and in my approach to teaching, which I feel like are very inextricable for me, I draw a lot on sociocultural theories of literacy, which kind of push back against the idea that literacy is purely reading and writing, as we often tend to understand it. And that literacy, pushes back on the idea that literacy is a universal or discrete set of skills, and that those skills are neutral. So sociocultural theorists really foreground this idea that literacy extends beyond reading and writing. It's not that it's not reading and writing, but it's all of the ways that we navigate our worlds. A lot of people may have heard of the concept of reading the world, which comes from Freire, right? All the ways we communicate and express ourselves. All of these are literacy practices, whether or not they're traditionally recognized as literacy. And that literacy, by that definition, is really socially located. It's specific to the contexts we're in, the knowledge we acquire there, how we're navigating particular spaces. So, by extending the definition of literacy beyond alphabetics, which is a very like Western and Eurocentric understanding of literacy, we can honor the wider array of ways of making meaning and communicating that students bring to the classroom. Well, that doesn't mean we ignore reading and writing education. That's really important as well. But I really try to center that in all of my work. And kind of, I guess, in conjunction with that, I do draw a lot on ideas from Paulo Freire, kind of the OG person that I discovered some of these ideas from. Actually, my first year teaching, I think like 24 years old. I was a high school teacher and I was grappling with a lot of like paradigms and discourses and all the things we grapple with as new teachers where we're like, coming up against our own values and ideals and other things we're asked to participate in. And I found Pedagogy of the Oppressed and a pile of trash walking home. And I was like, oh my, I don't know, like it felt like the universe brought it to me or something. So I still draw a lot on these ideas of reading the world and critical literacy. Literacy as a way to transform society and transform ourselves as individuals as well. Not just thinking about this reading the world concept or these multiple literacies as a valuable bridge into traditional print literacy, but is valuable in their own right. I also draw a lot on decolonial theories, which are really all about like dismantling hierarchies, which are a real hallmark of colonialism. And that includes knowledge hierarchies. So decolonial theorists push back against, again, these universalizing conceptions of knowledge, which of course we see play out heavily in schooling in terms of whose knowledge counts, whose knowledge doesn't. So decolonial theories really aim to excavate and uplift marginalized knowledge and perspectives that may not always be valued in school. Yeah, and within decolonial theory, I draw a lot on Chicana feminist scholars' work. And Chicana feminists really position lived experience as a valid form of knowledge, pushing back on the idea that things that are subjective are somehow less true or less meaningful. So that idea of lived experience as legitimate knowledge, as something that has transformative power, both in the world of education and beyond, is really important to my work as well.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm still taking it all in. Um,
You can go if any of these are too detailed of explanations, feel free to.
yeah, so one thing that and I am so sorry, I forgot to tell you this, is that I might take what you say and just, like, ask an additional question just to kind
Yeah.
of clarify or go in a direction because I find it fascinating. And you mentioned your big stuff on decolonial theories, and that is hard work because it's really ingrained and we're in a colonial power, right? Even if we don't use that term or think of it because this is just how we live. I guess maybe we'll go into that in my other question, but how do you even begin that work? Especially the practitioner level, that's so hard.
Yeah, I think it is really, really complicated, especially because, colonial ideologies are so deeply ingrained in schooling, especially in terms of, like I was saying, like whose knowledge counts, whose doesn't, how do we define literacy, even like the hierarchical nature of schooling as divided out by these really distinct grades with this concept of the normal child or, the grade level, below grade level, right? Like these things are quite arbitrary, but that hierarchical thinking is still super colonial in nature. So, yeah, I think it's really complicated. And I think finding ways to think about difference in education that are non hierarchical are a really important starting point. Like maybe, again, I'm talking a little bit more about K-12 here because that's where we see more of that kind of separation coming in. But we see it in like adult ed is similar, right? And I really appreciate New Mexico because they're so attuned to not using kind of deficit language. Like I encounter the term low literate and illiterate a lot in other spaces, and you don't really encounter that in New Mexico. In fact, I think even on the NMHED website, there's a like disclaimer talking about how that is not really terminology they espouse, like for these exact reasons that it really erases the kinds of literacy people do bring to the classroom. But in fact, I think sometimes K-12 could take a page out of adult ed's book in that way. But yeah, just finding ways to think about difference that don't position some people as lesser and some people as more feels really key to that, even if we're still operating within these larger kind of hierarchical structures.
No, absolutely. I also think I think it's a process too. Like it's not something, all right, we decolonized our program, that's it, we're done. We're
Right,
on the
right.
right track. It's it's a continuing process of reflection and work. Um,
Yes, it's very ongoing.
yeah, never ending, everybody. Keep that in mind. So I recall one of my professors, so I'm also a PhD candidate. worked on a lit review of adult literacy, adult education, and came up with very few research papers, especially in the last 20 years. And I also have another colleague who is in an EDD program who's also doing research, and they're struggling to find research specific to adult education too. And why might there be less research in our field and in this area? And how does your work contribute to that?
Yeah, this issue is one that's definitely familiar to me as well, especially when I was doing, the lit review for my dissertation. It was really, really hard for me to find a lot of research in adult literacy that kind of came from the paradigms I'm coming from, that drew on sociocultural theories, that took more critical perspectives. I think, one thing that limits the diversity of the amount and the diversity of scholarship we get in this area is the fact that adult literacy research has historically and continues to be underfunded, and that limits the amount that exists in general. And then because the federal adult education agenda has increasingly shifted towards, the language of workforce expansion and kind of prioritizing economic outcomes, that's also really privileged quantitative research, research that kind of comes from more narrow paradigms that match that. So there's even less, like I said, that come from these more critical perspectives. There's a real lack of qualitative research that also limits the kinds of insights we can get about adult literacy. There's a really interesting study. I can't remember the title right now, but the authors are Pickard and Beltzer. It's from 2015. But they did an analysis of every piece of qualitative research that had come out that depicted adult literacy learners in some way over the past like 3 decades or something. Like it was like a long period of time. I think it was 3 decades. And what they found was that adult literacy learners were depicted in narrow and often problematic ways within that research, as like helpless victims, as they put together sort of a series of archetypes from that. One was the helpless victim, one was the struggling learner. And so, yeah, I think it's really important that we're talking about how limited the research in this area is and working to address that and generate more and from more kinds of perspectives. And also just say, I really hope some of that can come from practitioners in the field as well, because I think action research and things that are coming out of adult ed spaces from the people who are on the ground is just so, so important in providing other kinds of insight and knowledge that can fill the gap you're talking about.
Absolutely. So, one thing that you did mention was this kind of more economic stream, and that's where we're at too. Like, I don't know if you've known this, but every program, not specific adult literacy, but adult education, has to have an IET program, and that is side by HD. It's a strategy for survival because we're in this really, yeah, we're in this really weird place in America right now, worried about funding,
Yeah.
and there is a constant push, push, push to those skills and the economic development for our students, right? And that kind of thing. And I feel like that kind of trickles down in some ways to just how we structure our classrooms, how we create activities, how we strategize.
Yeah.
Like again, for survival, but
Yeah.
that does have consequences.
Yeah. I agree. And I think adult ed and adult literacy, I mean, I speak about them kind of interchangeably, even though I know they're technically like different categories. But as we all know, like it's a really overlapping population, very similar goals. But I think like our programs come from some really radical histories, right? If we look at the work of Paulo Freire, if we look at, freedom schools, the work that's happening right now in so many classrooms, right? There's very radical work, and even when discourse or classrooms, like you're saying, might get a little more focused on testing or these economic outcomes, it still comes from a place of really wanting to pursue social justice, right? Wanting to do right by students, make sure education and, stable, economically stable futures are available to all people. But then at the same time, it's underpinned by kind of these logics of social efficiency, right? That are channeling certain groups of people towards certain sectors of society in the interest of a capitalist economy, right? There may be some overlap in interest there. Someone may want to go into what's considered, an in-demand field. And I think it would be very out of touch not to recognize the alignment between the goals of many individual students and these like kind of neoliberal goals, right? It's a matter of survival, like you said, for students, for programs. So I guess I'm kind of getting at our last question here a little bit, but I think for me, part of what feels important in operating within some of the current realities of that, while also not completely acquiescing to those logics, those social efficiency logics, and staying true to what adult ed's very radical roots, is just maintaining a critical stance towards it. Even like in our discourses as adult educators, right? We can talk about the historical and the social and the political forces that produce this emphasis on economic outcomes, right? Or that might sort of attempt to limit some of the futures that are available to our students or that are more easily available. Within the classroom, I think one way I try to offset that is thinking about, yeah, these skills are important and students come to the classroom with particular goals that include the development of skills, right? It's not that skills aren't important. It's not that supporting students to meet certain professional or economic goals isn't important, but I think teaching those skills within authentic contexts rather than decontextualized is really important for me. And then, situating it within culturally relevant curriculum, within meaningful contexts for learning. And then at the same time, teaching students to kind of examine the hidden politics behind, why are they maybe being channeled towards certain futures? Or why isn't funding available for that kid who wants to be a poet or a photographer in the same way? Plenty of my students have wanted to be poets and playwrights, and or even when we think about, how can we teach a grammar concept while also digging into why certain forms of English are considered more correct or academic than others, right? It's racism ingrained in our school system. So just kind of doing that work with students, I jotted down one of my favorite quotes from Lisa Delpit, whose scholarship I highly recommend. She says, "Students must be taught the codes of power, not by being forced to attend to hollow, inane, decontextualized subskills, but rather within the context of meaningful communicative endeavors. They must be allowed the resource of the teacher's expert knowledge while being helped to acknowledge their own expertness as well. And even while they're assisted in learning the culture of power, they must also be helped to learn about the arbitrariness of those codes and about the power relations they represent."
Could you say that person's name one more time?
Yeah, it's Lisa Delpit, Delpit.
Cool.
She writes a lot about kind of that tension. It's also really problematic if we're totally ignoring the fact that students, like, they do want to pass the GED exam or the high set exam. Like, there's real reasons for that. But how are we preparing them for some of those things, which can be super normative, right? And very Eurocentric? How are we preparing them in ways that allow them to dig into some of the issues there too and to continue doing that work in their own lives beyond our classrooms?
Absolutely. And wonderful stuff. And I really appreciate that quote. I just want to backtrack just real quick. Could you just define neoliberalism? Because I don't know if that is a term that everyone is
Yeah.
good with.
So, yeah, neoliberalism it's not a economic system, but it's a political ideology that really advocates for, free market capitalism. That's why it's often associated with capitalism, which is, the actual economic system, privatization, often at the expense of social services or the public good. Yeah, so kind of it's a political ideology and strategy that advances capitalism as an economic system. The US.
Yeah, basically. Thank you for that. Just want to make sure
Yeah.
we capture that.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
So So one thing that in our correspondence, you mentioned asset-based representations of adult learners. And I really love that term. And I just wanted to ask you, like, what would more asset-based representations of adult learners look like?
Great question. So I think creating more asset based representations of adult education students and adult literacy students, which again is an overlapping group, just want to name them distinctly as well, means talking about them, writing about them, creating opportunities for them to talk and write and share about themselves as well in ways that capture the complexity of who they are and in ways that honor all of that knowledge that they do bring to the classroom that is so often invisibilized because of these, dominant ideas around what constitutes literacy. The very real need programs often have too to sort of appeal in particular ways to get funding. And then I also think just generating more diverse narratives in general is really important. I think that's kind of tied into asset based representation specifically is yeah, kind of. I mean, I've said this a bunch of times in this podcast, but the ways this population is depicted can just be incredibly narrow. Even when it's not explicitly deficit based, it can just be very, very, very narrow and convey a set of problematic assumptions about who students are. When I worked at Tech, I wanted to create a library of books for students in our program that could also include books that were accessible to, newer readers, those considered adult literacy learners. And so we had the literacy grant at that time and I was like, yeah, I'm going to get all these books. And I started like researching and it was really, really hard for me to find books that seemed legitimately interesting for adult readers. Like so many of them centered around very narrow topics, things like starting a business, parenting, immigration. And there's nothing wrong with these topics at all. But a lot of the like companies producing these books, they would justify this by calling these real life relatable scenarios, or and yeah, they might be really relatable. Someone might really enjoy a book about that. But people also like mysteries and sci-fi and, a beach read and whatever else, the poetry. I don't read just about things that are relatable to me, even though, of course, literature that reflects us is incredibly important. I get to go and look at a full array of books and plots and characters and like kind of be recognized as a whole complicated human being with interests and I didn't feel like that was available for my students. And so, I did end up finding some good stuff, but it was really really difficult and if you type into ChatGPT, create me a reading passage for adult literacy learners, I actually did it 50 times in a row because I was curious what it would produce. I mean, it's like, it's stories about like so and so went to the grocery store, bought groceries, and went home. She was like proud of herself for buying the groceries. I look, there have been times I've been proud of myself for navigating a grocery store in a new place where I didn't speak the language or whatever, but very reductive. And I think convey an almost like, there's an understanding of these groups as almost childlike, right? And to be clear, I don't think children would like these plot lines either, but I think just the more we can offer students a wider variety of narratives and actually help them create some of these narratives, that's really important. I try to use adult education student authored texts in my classroom when I can. Some of those come from my former students. And part of my dissertation, we're creating a public facing story archive from the students in my class where I'm conducting that research from their work they're producing during the class, just so that more of that's available. So yeah, I really encourage other adult educators to get in touch with me if you want to contribute to that with your students and just help generate more narratives, involve students in that as much as possible. And we don't have to settle for some of the stuff that's available out there. We can find and create things that honor the full complexity and humanity of the people in our classroom who are regular
Wow.
adults like us.
Yeah, no, I love that project. Yeah, and after this, we'll add it to our webpage as well as our
Oh, I'd
YouTube.
love that.
Yeah, we'll just have to double check everything. But yeah, access to that is incredible and it's really exciting that you're working on a student created. assets. It's amazing.
Yeah.
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 So, what classroom structures support authentic meaning making rather than narrow skill training?
So I think above all, having a curricular vision that goes beyond the skills is essential, right? Those skills are important. And I certainly think about what kinds of skills I want to help students develop early on in my, curriculum planning process. But I'm also thinking what kinds of larger questions might they explore while building those skills. So just taking the time to create something that's cohesive, that spans, the limited but not insignificant time we have with students in our class. What questions or issues do you want them to investigate across this 6, 7, 8 weeks? How can the skills fit within that? How are they using these skills to work on projects that matter to them? And I think one thing I try to do as well to support more authentic meaning making is explicitly connecting what we're doing in the classroom to purposes that go beyond testing. I do also draw parallels between what we're doing and how this might show up, for example, on a GED test, because that is important, right? And it also, I want to honor students' goals, and that is one. So I want them always to understand how this connects to a particular, more short term goal. But I think it's really important for us to talk about that in relation to larger goals as well, right? The test doesn't have to be at the center of everything we do or say or be this primary motive all the time. So, for example, in language arts, why might it be critical or why might it be important to think critically about an author's perspective, right? To be able to parse that out within a text. Well, it's not only because you're going to be asked this on a GED exam, it's important because there's embedded bias within texts. We're encountering text everywhere in our lives, no matter what field we go into. So, a lot of my examples here are language arts based, but there's ways to do that in math and science as well. I do also want to acknowledge that adult educators have really limited planning time. And some of the things I've been able to do, it was because I was a full time employee at tech. And so I had more like flexibility there. Or, right now I'm teaching as part of my dissertation research. So I have time kind of carved out to do this kind of planning. And I do just want to acknowledge building this kind of larger curriculum, doing this work does take time. And I understand like the realities adult educators are often under. So I'd say, it's okay if you start small. Like, what can you do in this session that you can build on in the next one and in the next one and in the next one so that you're building up a repository of materials and lessons and of course adapting those to different groups over time. But it's okay if that kind of curricular vision building takes time too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that actually leads into it kind of answers a bit of our next question of just how can teachers design learning experience that affirms student agency and voice. Now, I was wondering if you can just give an example too.
Yeah. So it's always really important for me to get to know my students, figure out who they are, what motivates them. Of course, we all know they're motivated to, get their high school equivalency. So, there's, motivations we might know about, but what's driving those? Because that's going to be a little bit different for everybody. So really just getting to know them as people and getting to know what's the knowledge they bring to that space? What kinds of aspirations are they bringing there? What kinds of literacy resources, right? The ways they're able to read the world and finding ways to center that in my teaching, to use it, as a bridge into reading and writing, and also as something valuable in its own right, not just for, what it offers us as this bridge. I think that, that goes a long way in providing an affirming educational experience. Agency and voice, I think another thing that can be really powerful there is trying to offer students choices whenever you can, even if they're all working on the same kind of project, right? How can that still be made their own? I'm really into project based learning. So, in the class I just taught, and in most of my previous adult ed classes, we've done some version of this, but I'll usually do narrative reading and writing for the first part, often focused around like personal narrative in some way, and then some type of like informational or nonfiction focus for the second half. So in this most recent class I taught, even though students were all doing research projects in the second half of the class, because I think research, you develop a lot of skills through doing research that are applicable to a lot of different careers that allow you to, so that felt like a really important or a valuable thing to do with them. They were able to select their topic. They were also able to choose how they wanted to present that research. So there was some writing or language involved in all the options, but they could do a photo essay. They could do more of an article format. They could do an oral history. I tried to incorporate some readings and text that gave them examples of that as well. So I think there's a lot of ways we can honor the different ways students express themselves and learn and what they care about, even when they're actually kind of doing quote unquote the same thing. So for all my language arts teachers out there, I highly recommend personal narrative. Narrative writing gets a little like shafted within the CCRS because it's not considered valuable for professions, which again is so telling to me about what kinds of professions our students are imagined to go into. Um, it's very
Mhm.
relevant to many professions, including mine. But personal narrative is just so, so valuable to me because it offers a lot of choice in what you write about, how you tell about yourself. It lets you, the teacher, get to know so much about what those students are bringing to your room. And it also really supports super valuable writing skills. They're learning to write with volume, they're becoming more confident in themselves as writers. My students often tell me that it was actually personal narrative writing that really helped prepare them for the GED or the high set because they said they learned how to look at a page and know they could fill it. That's
Wow,
always
that's
stuck with
powerful.
me. Yeah. That's always really, really stuck with me. And it's something I try to point out to students as well, just so they also can understand how things that may not seem immediately test related actually do really prepare us for some of these necessary things we want to do to achieve our goals, including these tests.
Incredible. Thank you. Actually, again, like, you're kind of leading into or answer like, kinda answering the question, but it's fine, of just, like, how can student voices be centered in ways that resist stereotypical narratives? And you gave us this really wonderful example of personal narrative. Could you, like, give an example of maybe, like, a classroom work or an assignment of what that could look like?
Yeah. So I always start by again, we're like reading personal narratives. We're learning important reading skills through that. How to usually just in the beginning, like how do we read more deeply? Like a lot of the time, I learn like, students' reading skills, they're a lot higher than I hate to use that language of higher, lower, but there's a lot more there than may have first been evident because they may have a relationship with reading where they don't feel confident as readers or where they're maybe used to not understanding, not connecting. So they kind of just like plow through stuff, right? And we've all been there. Like we're just like, we just keep reading, even though we're kind of stopped processing that much of it. So yeah, just teaching students to really slow down, connect with what they're reading through various strategies. I do a lot of that with personal narrative because it's compelling. And I try to choose texts that might resonate with students' lives. I've used Jimmy Santiago Baca's work a lot, if you're familiar with him. Highly recommend checking out his stuff. He's a New Mexican poet and author. My students tend to really, really connect with him. And from reading within this genre, they're also generating ideas for their own personal narratives. So I really want to teach them the writing cycle as well, because that's something they can transfer to any kind of writing, any kind of like project design, really. So, we generate ideas, we try some of these different life stories out before they actually select one to continue forward with. And then we'll spend, a couple of weeks really developing that one piece, learning revision strategies. We'll often do peer revision. And again, I try to open this up to different kinds of modalities while also making sure students do get to do a lot of traditional writing and build kind of that writing volume and that confidence as a writer. But A lot of my students this last time chose to integrate photos with their personal narrative, or artwork with their personal narrative. So, yeah, sorry, I'm kind of like rambling at this
No, I
point,
love
but
it. No, no, these are really
okay.
great examples. Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, and actually that kind of relates to what I was saying earlier about the importance of having a curricular vision is when things can carry across sessions, even if you're honing in on certain skills or teaching kind of different mini lessons in those sessions, that continuity is really powerful, right? We're not just continuously writing these short test style responses to passages, but there's real sustained work on a single piece that's really valuable, I think, for people to get to experience. And it's always so beautiful to me to see how proud my students are of what they wrote or what they created. And yeah, just hearing so many of them talk about how they didn't think they could write something of that nature. And yeah, it's one of my favorite things about teaching, especially in adult ed.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate, your anecdotes and your examples. Oh, we're in the final question of just how can programs balance students' economic goals with holistic educational aims?
Yeah, the $1,000,000 question, right? So, I don't think there's any easy answer to this. And I talked about it a little bit before, but I think we have to kind of be able to hold tension around this as educators. And by that, I mean, there is a real reason why there is sometimes this outward alignment between kind of the neoliberal discourse, right, of economic gains and job readiness and our students' goals. And there's nothing wrong with our students' goals. We all have professional aspirations. We all need to make a livable wage. But I think, yeah, we can't forget the larger purposes of our work. How are we also teaching students to think critically and creatively as they develop the skills they need for the jobs they want? How are we letting them grapple with larger questions? How are they engaging with, authentic texts and materials that support them in grappling with those questions? We don't have to use just test prep material all the time, right? And I mentioned this, but I think we can speak about our class to students in ways that go beyond tests and go beyond that discourse.
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
we kind of take for granted this thought of we are more than our jobs. And
Yeah,
our students are more than their jobs or their aspiring jobs, right? And part of our work is, of course, getting to that point of their economic goals and helping our communities. But helping our communities isn't just economic. It's giving our learners these opportunities to grow where they want to grow or where and we can't possibly predict that and we don't dictate that and we should not.
yeah,
So maybe we do have a student that ends up becoming a truck driver. Maybe between stops, they write poetry.
yeah, right. Like, these aren't even mutually exclusive. Again, like, these are really complex people. We're all complex people. We we do all kinds of things in our lives, some of which we're paid for, some of which we're not. And I love that. Yeah, like, how can we foster all parts of who students are and support them in pursuing all of that in addition to yeah, I'm losing my train of thought here, but
That's okay.
yeah,
Yeah, we've been getting deep this episode.
yeah,
But
uh,
I think more than anything, just going back to what you said earlier about, like, the K-12 system and that kind of hierarchical thinking. I'm a K-12 graduate. Were you? Yeah.
yep,
And that system gave me the foundation I needed to get to a point to continue to learn and grow as an
yeah,
adult. However, it also and again, there wasn't some, evil teachers that were suppressing me or principals, but it didn't help me grow in certain ways
yeah,
and it didn't give me that space to learn who I was,
yeah,
right? And that those kind of hierarchical systems do kind of push us down a little bit. So there is that space. And I think what you're speaking to so much is like, if we center that on our curriculum and our thoughts and our reflective teaching, we can get to that space of a healthier balancing act, a middle ground where we can support our students in their growth while also giving them the skills that they need to move beyond our programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And in literacy in particular right now, there's such a false binary being constructed between, phonics and other forms of alphabetic knowledge or what we might consider like traditional literacy and, sociocultural approaches to literacy or bringing in, the funds of knowledge students bring that go beyond print literacy. And like, that is just not true. Students learn to read and write better when who they are and what they bring is valued, when what they're practicing those skills within contexts that really matter to them, or they're applying them to things that matter, which again is like so core to the ethos of adult ed, right? But yeah, just being skeptical of binaries that sometimes get painted for us, I think are important, especially right now.
Yeah, and just to end on that is I feel like binary thinking is very easy for us to do. Our brains naturally go towards that, and even our systems, good
Yeah.
versus evil, black and white, but we don't really live binary lives.
No.
We nature does not create binaries either in that way. So having to move beyond that is an active work too. It's a
Yeah.
continual process, and
Yeah.
just to remember that.
Right. We can
Yeah,
acknowledge the very real material benefits that WIOA funding, for example, brings to our students, and also acknowledge how it's kind of underpinned by like a social efficiency model of education or certain logics that may not disrupt structural conditions, I think. Yeah.
absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. Thank you so much, Victoria. This was an incredible conversation. I really appreciate your space and your time, your energy, and your thoughts to be brought. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the kind of work that you come out with, your dissertation and beyond.
Oh, thank you. I so appreciate you guys hosting me. I absolutely love, my home state and the world of adult ed and adult literacy. And my time working in that space in New Mexico has massively influenced the trajectory of my career, my decision to get a doctorate. And so it's very much an honor to get to be on the podcast.
It's an honor to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't forget about My Adult Ed Story, a continuous project that highlights the lived experiences and origin stories of adult education and literacy practitioners. Each story is unique, and the more we learn about each other, the stronger our network becomes. Please consider sharing your written or audio recorded story with us. A link to the My Adult Ed Story page, as well as submission instructions, are included in this episode's description. We look forward to growing this collection.
Connect with Adult Ed, the NMEA podcast, is a project of the Propel Professional Learning System and is funded by the New Mexico Higher Education Department's Adult Education Division. Thank you for listening.